Hello everyone, and once again welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of the largest simulation to date from 1947 to 2100. So I've simulated the NBA on basketballgm.com, which is a free website that allows you to be the general manager of a franchise or just to put the franchise on autopilot, and it pulls real historical data and uses real players to simulate the NBA, and it even uses real players that are not in the NBA yet but are projected to be for the future up until a certain point where it starts making randomly generated players. So for this second part of the video, we're going to take a look at the more statistical analysis side of the data that we've gathered. We're going to take a look at the 3-point attempts, 3-point percentage, field goal percentage, offensive rating, and a lot of other advanced stats, how they trended over time, both in the simulation and in the NBA in real life. And of course, we're going to compare the two and see if there are any correlations. So for the first set, I've used the simulation data, which Basketball GM provides you at the end of every simulation. And for every season, Basketball GM recorded the 3-point attempts, 3-point percentage, field goal percentage, points per game by teams, assists per game, total rebounds per game, steals per game, and blocks per game, the averages across the entire league per team. Of course, this is slightly different from real life as the three-pointers weren't introduced until the early 80s and the NBA. They were much earlier in the ABA, but this is talking about the NBA. So of course, some of these statistics have been recorded in Basketball GM, but have not showed up in real life for a while. So we're going to look at that once we compare the two stats, but it's still interesting to see the trends. So in terms of the graphs, so we have 3-point attempts, and this is the graph of 3-point attempts from 1947 to 2100. It's interesting to see that as you would expect, the 3-point attempts have skyrocketed, of course, since their introduction in 1980. And I'm assuming that the very low values before 1980s were an attempt of the game to kind of mimic the fact that there were no 3-pointers in the NBA before 1980. So as you can see here, a lot of the 3-pointers skyrocketed between 2007 onward up until 2020, which that's where the simulation in real life ends, of course. But later on, as you can see here, the simulation kind of dropped a little bit, the 3-point attempts, kind of around 30, from 35 or 34 back to 30, and rather kept constant over time up until 2100. Of course, and as we can see later on, this is kind of a trend in most of these numbers. They kind of like dropped or slightly increased after 2020, but then stay relatively constant, which is likely a way of the game to compensate for the fact that nobody truly knows how the game is going to evolve in the future. So it's probably a lot of noise and a lot of different variables that are taken into account. But it's still interesting to see that the peak of 3-point attempts per game was around the 2020 season with almost 35 attempts, which pretty much mimics real life, as we can see later. In terms of 3-point percentage, once again, very similar percentages. Earlier on, the percentage was very bad, mostly likely due to the fact that there was only 0.1 attempts per game, if any at all. However, since the introduction, it has steadily increased to around 36-37% and has since remained steady in the simulation. So once again, the 2020 mark is around here, and since then it has decreased slightly, but then kind of hovered around 35%. The field goal percentage follows a similar trend. It peaked in the early 1980s in this simulation in 1990s with around 50%, and then dropped to 2020 when it was around 46% or 45%, and then kind of maintained a steady 45-46% for the rest. So this is very similar to what we see in real life, and this probably has a lot to do with the rise in 3-point attempts and 3-point shots, because of course 3-point shots affect field goal percentage in a negative way, as by field goal percentage they're valued as if they were 2-pointers, since it's a raw statistics. But more statistics like true shooting percentage can help kind of compensate for the increased 3-point rates. So if we take a look at the graph that has both 3-point percentage and field goal percentage, we can take a look at that and see that both of them increased, although of course the units are slightly different. Both of them increased in as the 3-point was introduced, and then kind of like flattened out for the rest of the simulation. If we take a look at points, we see a trend that's very similar to what we'll see happen in real life. As many of you know, in the 60s and early 70s, the game was much faster and a lot more points were scored. This is why Wilt Chamberlain was able to average over 50 points per game, and lots of people average over 30 points per game. And we see also a decline right here, 1999, which is this season, also in real life was one of the lowest scoring seasons of all time if we exclude the earlier NBA seasons. But then since then, the pace has picked up, and we're left with today where teams are scoring over 130 points on a regular basis, of course, although still the average is a little over 100. And then since then, like we've seen with 3-point percentage, it's sort of like stagnated and flattened. So just as a point of reference, I'm more interested in seeing what happened in the simulation in the past and not what actually happens in the future, because that's, of course, it's impossible to predict, and we have no way of comparing it to anything since we don't have data from the future, unfortunately. With assists, we see a similar story here. We see a decline in assists around the 90s and early 2000s as the ISO games with guards like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and even Tim Duncan. With more ISO possessions, of course, there are less assists. And then a slight rise in assist numbers later on up until 2020. And then again, a flattened curve. With rebounds, we see a slightly different story here. Of course, earlier on, rebounds were extremely more frequent. Earlier on, big men could average up to like 30 or more rebounds per game if they wanted. And the peak season was around 1950 with almost 57 rebounds per game. However, the lowest rebounds per game were around 1997 or so on. Then it slightly increased, then decreased up until 2020 where it peaked and then kind of flattened overall, once again, just like most things do in the simulation. Steals is a little more irregular, even for the simulation in the future. Steals peaked in 1960 and 1970, then dropped all the way down to 2000, and then kind of started to slowly rise up and then slowly decline over time. Blocks are arguably one of the most variable statistics, and once again, it's important to look at the y-axis. We're talking about anywhere between 4 to 5.5, so not huge difference, on less than 1.5 blocks per game difference. So again, nothing too crazy in terms of the amount of blocks per game. There's a lot of variability and a lot of noise overall, so nothing too interesting from this. So I ran a Pearson correlation test among all these variables, and of course you'll see the one number for the same variable. Of course, there is a strong correlation between the two. And don't worry if this looks scary. The easier way to understand this is if the correlation coefficient, which is that number between -1 and 1, is either above 0.5 or below -0.5, it means that there is a strong correlation between the two factors. If it's above 0.5, it means there is a strong direct correlation. So as one increases, the other increases as well. And if it's less than -0.5, there is a strong negative correlation, meaning that if one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. So excluding the 1, of course, which are the same variable on each side of the square, we can see that there is a strong correlation between 3-point attempts and 3-point percentage. So as 3-point attempts increase, 3-point percentage also increase in this simulation. And there is other important things are a strong correlation between field goal percentage and points. Of course, as the field goal percentage increases, more points are likely to be scored. Same thing with assists, and this is an even stronger correlation. As the field goal percentage increases, the assists, of course, increase, because that means that a pass is more likely to result in a teammate making a bucket if the field goal percentage is higher. There is also a very strong correlation between steals and rebounds, which that's surprising. I don't really know exactly why. If you may have a hint as to why, please feel free to comment. It might just be a statistical noise. However, there seems to be a rather strong correlation between the two. Now, onto the negative correlations. There was an interesting negative correlation, very strong negative correlation between total rebounds and 3-point percentage and steals and 3-point percentage. So this was very interesting, and I'm not really sure exactly as to why that is as to why if the 3-point percentage increases, the total rebounds decrease. And I'm not sure whether to categorize it as a signal noise, simply because it does not have any correlation with 3-point attempts. Both of them do not. So it might just be statistical noise. But one correlation that to me is not statistical noise is the field goal percentage and total rebounds, which is negative 67.67. And that means that as field goal percentage decreases, total rebounds increase, which makes sense because if you shoot worse, the ball is not going to go in the basket. It's going to rebound off the board, and somebody's going to have to catch it. So the total rebounds in a game increase as the field goal percentage decreases. So that made a lot of sense to me. And of course, there are some very weak links, like with no correlation whatsoever between points and rebounds, or say field goal percentage and 3-point attempts. That doesn't really seem to have a correlation. But feel free to save this image or to just look at it, and you might find something else that's really interesting. I thought it was really cool to be able to do this. I also analyzed some advanced stats that were provided by Basketball GM. Offensive rating, for some reason, offensive rating and defensive rating were the same numbers, which might be a glitch in the system. But assuming that just offensive rating is the correct one, we see that the offensive rating of teams increased almost in a curved fashion, but almost in a linear fashion over time with a predictable slope. And it peaked around 2020, of course, and then slightly dropped. If we look at pace, this is very resembling of what real life was. In 1960, that was by far the highest pace, and the lowest pace was in the Jordan era, which makes all his scoring titles and all his stats even more impressive. And then pace has slightly started to pick up to where we're at similar levels of the 1970s, which is fair, which is close to what it is today. In terms of true shooting percentage, once again, this makes a lot of sense in terms of the fact that as 3-point attempts and 3-point percentage increase, true shooting percentage increases because teams are taking more valuable shots, with the whole story of like avoiding mid-rangers and favoring corner trees or layups and dunks, or just any trees in general. That will increase your true shooting percentage. And if we run a correlation analysis on these, we find some interesting patterns. Of course, ignore D1 once again, and ignore anything that has defensive rating instead of offensive rating. Just for the sake of this, and likely due to a glitch, these two are the same, so of course they're going to be a 1. There's a really interesting correlation between a stat that I actually haven't shown, but 3-point attempt rate and free throw attempt rate, which is very, very interesting how when one increases, the other one decreases, likely because 3-pointers are much less likely to be fouled than a 2-point attempt or any other shot. So this reduces the rate of free throws. So probably as 3-point attempts increase, there is less fouling on the player who's shooting a 3-pointer, and therefore less free throw attempts. It was also interesting to notice that free throw attempts seem to have a negative effect on the offensive rating. So as one increases, the other one decreases. And I'm not really sure why. This is likely due to the fact that offensive rating favors like high pace and a lot of like possessions and stuff, and free throws kind of slow the game down. So as the rates of free throws goes higher, of course that's going to go down. And then other interesting finds were true shooting percentage and free throw rate kind of go are like the opposite. So as one increases, the other one decreases, which is really interesting. I would have never thought about it. And another fascinating correlation, which is pretty common sense, but it's nice to be seen again in numbers, is that 3-point attempt rate kind of goes hand in hand with the offensive rating. So as teams take more 3-pointers, the offensive rating will be higher. Next, we're going to move on to real life stats, and these were pulled from NBA.com, which has publicly available statistics, free to anyone, and you can just put them in an Excel file and just analyze them for yourself. 3-point attempts, once again, this is pulled from when 3-pointers were first recorded in 1980, and they were first available up until today. So this is no projection. This is what actually happened in real life with real players. So 3-point attempts pretty much show the gradual increase, and from 2012 onward, it's been a pretty steep increase. 3-point percentage, relatively similar to what we would expect. field goal percentage, once again, it dropped right here as there were more ISO possessions and around the 19s and early 2000s, but then started to slowly pick up. Once again, this is field goal percentage, so that means that three-pointers are not accounted for their whole value. So it's not natural that as teams take more three-pointers, the field goal percentage could go down. In terms of points, we see a trend that, we also say now that teams are scoring a lot more points, and that is true, especially compared to the late 1990s. And teams are scoring at a similar rate as the 70s and the late 60s, which is pretty much on par with what we see today. In terms of assists, of course, as we have more points and less ISO, the assist numbers are going to go up. And today we see a lot of players averaging a lot of assists. And around this time is when Magic Johnson and stuff were in the league. So, of course, you'll see a lot of assists. And later on, around the 2000 eras, that when lots of ISO players, and of course, less assists. In terms of total rebounds, this is fascinating to me. I mean, I had realized that there were less rebounds overall, but this was shocking to see how little rebounds we pull today compared to the 1960s. Today, we pull an average of 45 rebounds per game or less. In the 1960s, they pulled over 70 rebounds per game, which makes sense why Wilt and Russell were able to average such high rebounding numbers. In terms of steals, steals have gone way down since the 1970s when they were first recorded. The lowest point was around the 2010, and it's slightly picked up. However, it's probably just a noise signal, and it's likely to stagnate for the near future. Do not necessarily know why. Maybe due to the fact that teams are taking more three-pointers, and there may be less opportunity for defenders to steal the ball. However, I do not exactly know why that is the case. In terms of blocks, we always talk about Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and how many blocks they would have averaged. Well, we will never know because they were not recorded, but many say that Wilt averaged over 8 blocks per game. In terms of blocks here, since they were recorded, it's been relatively flat. Of course, this looks very variable, but it's important to keep in mind that the values here goes from 4 to 6, so it's a relatively small variable here. In terms of pace, this totally makes sense. We always talk about how the game has slowed down in the 2000s, but then picked up the pace today. So the pace today is comparable to the pace of the 1980s, which makes total sense. And teams are scoring more points. There is a higher offensive rating. And speaking about higher offensive rating, today we have the highest offensive rating that we've ever had in the history of the league since it's been recorded. And this has a lot to do with three-pointers and the fact that offenses are tailoring their shots to maximize the points per possession. And it's no coincidence that the Dallas Mavericks, the highest offensive rated team in the league today, have the highest rated offense in the history of the NBA, while not even being a top 5 seed in their own conference. This was another interesting stat, which does not, of course, correlate to much else, but the average weight of an NBA player. Once again, this was tracked from the very earliest days of the NBA, not the very first season, but in the mid-50s up until today. And it's interesting to see that, especially here, we have the big man era, and a lot of the Patrick Ewing, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, and so forth, or Hakeem Olajuwon and such. But then we peaked around, which is really interesting, we peaked around 2015 or so, and then started to drop, maybe as teams adopted a more small ball lineup. We've seen the Houston Rockets do it. However, it's very interesting. I would have not picked this to be the case, that we peaked in 2010 or 2013. It's really interesting to see. A lot of it has to do with player conditioning, which of course a lot of muscle mass is being put on, and we're talking about hyper athletic players, of course, the best of the best. So, and also it's important to look at the range here goes from around 195 pounds to 225 pounds. So a pretty sizable weight difference, but nothing too crazy. So this, of course, might have a lot to do with player have better conditioning and better resources to up their muscular mass in a more natural way. So I've taken a look at all these real life statistics and tried to do a correlation heat map. And once again, I found some pretty shocking results. First of all, as we expected, there is a very strong connection between three-point percentage and three-point attempts, which we had seen in the simulation as well. There is also a negative correlation between three-point percentage and field goal percentage, which once again we had seen in real life. Something that I thought was very interesting is the negative correlation between points and three-point percentage, which to me doesn't make much sense. And I'm asking you, if you know, to comment what your hypothesis as to why that is. And by the same token, there is a very strong negative correlation between assists and three-point percentage, which doesn't really make that much sense to me. Players, usually three-pointers, a lot of them are assisted, so that doesn't make much sense. And I would think that as the three-point percentage goes up, that assists would also go up, but this seems to suggest the opposite. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is the three-point percentage and pace. They have a negative correlation. And the three-point percentage and weight have a very strong positive correlation, which once again is very interesting, as you might think of, NBA, the NBA big mans, meaning like they wouldn't take that many three-pointers. However, if I have to take a guess, due to the fact that the average weight of an NBA player has risen in the recent years, this is why there's a strong correlation, because the three-point percentage has also risen in recent years for reasons completely unrelated. So this is a lot of statistical noise, of course. Other things that I found relatively comforting were the fact that points and assists had a very strong correlation at 71.71, and points and field goal percentage also had a very strong positive correlation. Points and pace, of course, have a very strong positive correlation. And yeah, that was most of what I was thinking. And also assist and field goal percentage, as we said. In terms of offensive rating doesn't seem to be too skewed by many things. The only thing was total rebounds. Rebounds seem to affect offensive rating a little bit, although the correlation is not that strong. And in terms of blocks, of course, we have points. In terms of pace, we have points influencing it, assists and rebounds, which as they all go up, they will increase the pace, and steals as well. So all the major 5 statistical categories increase pace, but weight, the average weight, seems to be decreasing the pace as the average weight goes up. So this is very interesting. Of course, there is, this only shows correlation and not causation, as we've talked about. This is by no means an accurate representation of what caused what in the NBA, but it's just interesting to see that there might be a relationship between variables that we never thought of. For the final part, we're going to take a look at merging the simulation and real life, and this is field goal percentage. As you can see, the real life is in black and the simulation is in green, and it's staggering what the similarity is. As you can see here, they closely mimic one another, and the simulation happens to follow closely what in real life truly happened. And of course, nobody can predict the future, but if this is an indicator, it seems to be a really good indicator. The same thing with points. Points follow literally to a T what the real life points per game averages has in the past, and since the very early days of the NBA, even with this major spike in the 1950s and 1970s, this is what the simulation also shows. And finally, with pace, we also find a very similar value. Of course, there are some minor differences which comfort me in saying that the game did not exactly mimic the NBA, but it's encouraging to see that the trend follows pretty much what the NBA did in real life. And of course, here pace wasn't measured before the 1970s in the NBA, but the simulation still did. And of course, the future, we may never know. But it's really encouraging to see. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really enjoyed putting this together. And special thanks, of course, to GraphPad Prism, which is the software that I use to make these graphs. And to Basketball GM, which is the free software I used for the data, and NBA.com, which is the website that I pulled the real life data from. So yeah, I encourage you to read a little bit more about this and to maybe pause when you see a graph on the screen and just take a deeper look at it, because it took me quite a few minutes to come up with these graphs and analyze them. So I encourage you to do the same. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to comment or to just message me or something if you would like to reach out, or if you have any questions, or if you have any concerns regarding it. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye bye.